Hey Draper, how you doing?
I'm doing all right, Jason. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Hey, so I read your story. Long story short, and it was a bit of a long story. It seems like the theme is Colin Powell's still pissed, and now he's talking. Do I have it
Well,
about?
the theme is an excerpt from my book, and my book, To Start a War: How the Bush Administration Took America into Iraq, is a lengthy, narrative accounting for that saga. And Colin Powell certainly is a major character in that. We focused in the New York Times Magazine excerpt of it just on Powell, and in particular on the fateful speech that he gave to the United Nations on February 5th, 2003, that was really used as the vehicle to sell the war, to sell the case for war to an American public that still was to some degree on a fence about it. Powell, I think it could be charitably said, was disserved uh, by the content of that speech that was largely provided to him by the U.S. intelligence community, who assured him that all that stuff was on the level, and obviously it turned out not to be at all. Powell feels, I think, like he was strung out to dry, was railroaded. You'll recall, Jason, that just less than 2 years after that, he was pushed overboard and no longer the Secretary of State, replaced by Condoleezza Rice, and is aware that as really a true American hero, his epitaph is going to include mention of that notorious speech. So he feels, in a lot of ways, I think, tarred by a you know a really really unfortunate chapter in an even larger and more unfortunate history, the decision to invade Iraq.
Yeah, one thing that really jumped out at me about your story was how bad George Tenet comes across.
Yeah, others have said that too, and I do think that Tenet was in an extremely difficult, maybe impossible situation, trying to protect the institution of the CIA on the one hand, but on the other hand, trying to accommodate the president. And In a way, you really couldn't do both. And once it became clear that the president was going to go to war, or when Tenet believed it was clear that he was going to go to war, he made a decision, again, I think a fateful one, well, I'm going to help. And that's not the CIA's job to help make any case for war. They're just there to give you the uncomfortable truths, and you can do that with that as you will. Tenet had a legitimate concern that if the CIA was shut out of the process, then Bush would be relying on unreliable voices, relying on phony intel, and he believed that the intelligence community that he represented could give him the best shot at understanding what the ground truth was. But in the end, that ground truth got mischaracterized, got manipulated, and so yeah, it's Tenet does not come off as in a glowing way, I'm afraid.
Yeah, although he did leave public service with what, a Congressional Medal of Honor or something that.
Yes, he did. The president awarded him the Distinguished Medal for Service, but I think that with that, came the understanding that George, we don't want to hear any carping. You're going to be, we're going to kind of throw you under the bus, and indeed,
Mm.
in subsequent accounts of the lead up to war, the Bush administration would lead people to believe that it was George Tenet who'd said, when a doubting president wondered, wow, is there really a strong enough case to go to war? Does Saddam really have weapons of mass destruction? That it was the director of the CIA who said slam dunk, which is a misrepresentation, as I say in my account, of what actually took place that day.
That was really fascinating. I love that bit. That was great reporting.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome. Hey, so when all this was going down in 2003, it seemed pretty obvious for those of us who've been paying attention all along that the Bush administration was shifting their pretext for war, that they were rushing ahead, that they were, I mean, doing the UN speech while there were weapons inspectors still in Iraq,
Right.
made it pretty clear that they didn't care what the results were. They're just going to go to war.
Yeah, well, I think that I mean, I am among those, maybe among the few of those who believe that President Bush was not deliberately lying, not deliberately misleading. I think that he made a bunch of misleading statements, But that was not his intention. I think he truly believed Saddam had weapons. He truly believed that Saddam was so crafty and so nefarious that poor hapless Hans Blix and the rest of the weapons inspection team would never be able to find it. I mean, and unfortunately, if you start with that supposition that Saddam's got the weapons and you don't find any, then you just come to the conclusion well, they're not finding them because they're incompetent. And that was the other thing too, was that Bush was of the belief that, well, if Saddam wants to come clean, he should just bring all his weapons out into a parking lot and show them there. That he didn't do so to Bush's eyes was evidence of intransigence, when in fact it was evidence that Saddam did not have any freaking weapons of mass destruction.
So the fact that the weapons inspectors didn't find weapons was proof that they were really good at hiding the weapons. That's
right. Yeah. No. Again, part of this was, and the CIA signed on to this too, was a belief that Saddam had spent the last 10 years deceiving weapons inspectors when they were in the country throughout the 90s. And it's true that they didn't come immediately clean. Part of that was because momentarily they did have things to hide. Part of it was they wanted Iran to think they had weapons for defensive purposes. Their next neighbor, an Islamic theocracy, was a clear and present danger to Saddam's regime, and he wanted to have a balance of terror. Part of it also was that the weapons inspectors who were trucking through Iraq, the Iraqi regime didn't trust, thought they were like CIA guys who were looking into government buildings. And guess what? They were right. There were CIA embeds among the weapons inspectors. So we had this notion that Saddam was being nefarious and deceptive, and he had this notion that we were the same. It's this infuriating sub-narrative of kind of Mars and Venus, of these two who are alike in the way that they fail to understand each other and their motives. Yeah. I talked to a social scientist who studied group conflict. Mm-hmm. And he says one thing that always contributes to group conflict, whether it's in South Africa or this country or Northern Ireland, is we think that the group that opposes us is twice as bad as we imagine. Right. Yeah. And they think the same of us. So we're always trying to meet what a misperception of the threat. The other thing too is that if you settle on a narrative that someone is evil, then that means they are capable of anything, and then it follows that they're probably doing anything and everything, when Saddam was a really bad dude who was terrible to his people. But that it does not follow logically that means he's suicidal and is willing to risk his own regime to go attack a far stronger country. And there was all this push among Cheney and Wolfowitz and others in the administration to prove that Saddam was linked up to 9/11. Well, here's the thing. The 9/11 hijackers didn't need Saddam Hussein. They had box cutters. That's all they needed. Yeah. So what exactly was it that Iraq would have furnished them, and what was the risk that the 9/11 hijackers were willing to undertake by spreading their umbrella of people who knew about this stuff? It just simply didn't make sense. But again, if you proceed from the belief that this guy is the worst man on earth because he'd done A, B, and C, and therefore almost surely is doing X, Y, and Z, then you become blind to your own biases. Yeah. Hey, so has researching this book, reporting this book, given you any new perspective on your industry, on journalism, and how they might have met that moment better? Yeah, I think that Jason there's no question, but that we'll never know if stronger pushback from the media as well as from Congress would have prevented the president from going to war. What we do know is that strong pushback didn't exist, and that there was, in effect, a glide path. There were certainly critical things written, some doubtful things written, but also there was a lot of credulousness, which I think owes itself to a lot of things. One of it is just simply hard to pierce the veil of intelligence. And when the CIA tells you ABC is true and we have solid sourcing, it's hard for you to disprove that. But a lot of it is that confirm the biases of even some fairly liberal reporters who had reported on Saddam's atrocities in the 1980s in Halabja against the Kurds, in the 1990s against the Shia. And once again, they believe this is a bad guy. And on top of which, you have to factor in, Jason, that a lot of the press also hadn't seen 9/11 coming. They were as embarrassed by that as the administration was. They were just as vigilant about trying to anticipate the next wave, which they were sure was coming. And so it occurred to them, this bad dude who's out there, Saddam Hussein, who said lousy things about us after 9/11, saying we deserved what we got, could very well be where the next front will be.
So that's kind of like a lot of your brethren and all their visits to Pennsylvania coffee shops after 2016.
Yeah, yeah, to some degree. I mean, I certainly think that it is not. I mean, the moments where you get things wrong should spur introspection rather than doing the obvious course of action, which is to fall back on your old beliefs, on your old biases, and I'm afraid a lot of that is what happens.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, I do think that a lot of people were burned in the media by the Iraq fiasco. The truth is, not a whole lot of people in my industry have suffered from it. Just like a lot of people in the Bush industry and the intelligence community who are way wrong, are doing just fine in their careers. I mean, not many heads toppled as a result of all this.
Yeah, yeah, it's a shame. So your book ready for pre-order?
Yeah, it is. You can find it pre-ordered through your independent bookseller or through Amazon, whichever you prefer. And one thing I'll say about it, Jason, is that I realize the question is kind of begged of well, why now? And I think that when we look at where we are now, with Trump as president, part of how we got here was through the rejection of expertise that candidate Trump was then citing. He was saying, look, Bush and his so-called experts led us into this awful war, and the intelligence community got everything wrong. And the notions of fake news, and for that matter, America First, have their origins in the Iraq debacle. For that matter, as we see right now with COVID, I mean, we're reminded that leadership really matters, and bad leadership really matters too. But it's also worth thinking about that, when we see the incompetence that we're seeing, that experience isn't always the answer. That if President Joe Biden steps in, that it necessarily means things will be better, because say what you will about the Bush people. I mean, they were very experienced. These were the conservative version of the best and the brightest, and Joe Biden listened to them too. Joe Biden voted for the authorization of war. I'm certainly not suggesting that this means he would be an inferior choice to Donald Trump, but it also is not, dare I say it, a slam dunk. That if he's listening to the same voices that he tended to listen to, rather than to outside, more skeptical voices, which did indeed exist, then he could go down the same path.
Yeah, the one thing that gives me some hope there is that there are so many people now in the national security apparatus who fought in these wars.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, and I think as well that that there has been a lot of soul searching in the intelligence community about what went wrong with Iraq, and I think they, in fact, if anything, we're seeing them being over caveated. You see, like in the Russian bounty program, that we're hearing. I mean, this is the intelligence community like saying, well, there may not be a consensus. We're not so sure. They've got, the reporting has gotten kind of ahead of the intelligence community, and some of that may be because Trump, punishes people in the IC, but it's also because they have become over. I mean, it's sort of axiomatic, and worth a discussion unto its own, whether President Obama overlearned the lessons of Iraq and was, maybe too walking on eggshells when it came to policies in the Middle East. You could argue that the same thing has happened with the CIA and others in the intelligence community, that they have thought, we allowed our assessments to be read as statements of fact, and we will not do that again. Nonetheless, we still expect as close to as we can get from the ground truth, and one still hopes they're willing to provide it.
Yeah. Draper, there is no one better in the business at talking about his writing than you are. It is a pleasure to hear you talk. It's great.
I appreciate that, Jason.
All right, man. Talk to you later.
Take care, man. Bye-bye.